So now I'd like to introduce David Rudlin, who is director of Urbed. I'm sure most of you have heard of David. And he's an honorary professor at Manchester. I didn't know that. That's where I live, so yeah. And worked in Manchester. No wonder you're into sustainability. But let David introduce what he's going to talk about.
Thank you, Rachel. As you say, I'm based in Manchester. I was in a meeting yesterday. Manchester has committed itself to be a zero-carbon city, and I was at a meeting of the property chapter of Manchester Zero Carbon City. And Manchester's done a really, starts off a really interesting piece of work. It's taken the Paris climate target of 1.5 degrees. It's worked out how much carbon Manchester as a city can emit before the end of this century, which is 15 million tonnes. And it's worked out at current rates how quickly it would use that up, which is 7 years. So 7 years, 7 years at current rates will use up Manchester's entire carbon budget until the end of the century. That is in a city which is reducing its carbon output by 7% a year at the moment. So far from going up, as Paul said, in terms of global terms, British cities are actually decarbonising quite rapidly. They're doing so, however, because the electricity grid is decarbonising necessarily rather than what they're doing themselves. So that's a bit of context, because what happened in that discussion was we thought, shit, how are we going to do that? And there was an absolute buy-in to the absolute urgency of what we need to do, and an absolute inability to see how we were ever going to do it in the time available, because we can paint pictures, as Paul has just done very compellingly, of the sustainable city, but getting from where we are now to where we need to be is a whole different ballgame, and one which is actually quite depressing. So that's what I want to focus on. My brief is to talk about spatial planning, which is one of the reasons which is difficult. So how sustainable urbanism requires effective spatial planning. So the problem with this discussion is that we talk about sustainable urbanism or quality design or urban well-being or healthy cities or even urban resilience. And whenever we have those discussions, and we've all sat in meetings and conferences over the last few years on each of those subjects and many more, and we're all told when we do that cities are really important. So we're told that, in order to solve this or that issue, cities are really important. We're also told that we must try much harder, and so we must try much harder to make these cities better for, and you can insert the issue that you're interested in after that point. But they don't always tell us what we should do, particularly on things like mental health. We're told cities are vital, but actually I'm yet to see anyone who tells me what I should be doing in my day-to-day job to deal with mental health in cities. It's not actually told us what we should do. And even if they do tell us, they assume what we're going to go is, of course, sorry, we hadn't realised that that's what we were supposed to be doing. We shall do it now. The reality is that we all know this is what we need to be doing. We all know sustainability in cities is crucial and we should be doing it. We're not doing it because we haven't been convinced. We're doing it because it's so difficult to actually make change. And that's the point. It's not because we aren't convinced. And a lot of the work that goes on is convincing us further. It doesn't matter. We're already convinced. We need to work out how to do it. So what does sustainable development look like? It doesn't look like this, I can tell you. This is Bill Dunster redesigning a Chinese city to maximise solar gain. Great, but actually the sustainable city is not just about one issue. You can't design an entire city based upon solar gain. Here's another example of the same thing from the Bauhaus back in the 1920s. It doesn't look like this, which is Marx Barfield autonomous skyscraper, even though I think I saw some of them in the back of your slides. Again, you don't take an issue, ruin a city to create a single issue response to a thing. It doesn't, I dare to say, even look like this. This is Bourneville Village Trust and the Garden City. I'll come back to garden cities in a minute, but this idea that there are one-stop solutions to these things is a reductionist approach to cities which has always ended badly. Any time we've said cities should be like this and this is the only issue we should optimise, we always create problems. So this is, it's always a little bit pretentious to quote from yourself, but this is a quote from my first book that I wrote about 20 years ago, that we won't achieve sustainable development for building super green homes in the countryside for the committed minority. We need to build for the majority, and that majority is overwhelmingly urban. So this, I think, is probably a bit more what a sustainable city looks like, which is Vathorst in Holland. It's sustainable because it's walkable, because levels of car ownership are very low, because it has a local heating system, communal heat and power system. It has a good recycling waste system and so on. This is probably about as close as we get in Europe at the moment to what a sustainable city look like. And I like those two slides because they look very similar. That's actually Letchworth Garden City from the 1920s. And the point being that we came very close to being quite good at this, and then somehow lost our nerve since the Second World War and have become incredibly bad at it. And so the reform that we need to do to get to a point where we can change the way our cities work is actually huge. So a few years ago, 2014 now, we were fortunate enough to win the Wolfson Economics Prize, which was about garden cities. And we entered it because we don't agree with garden cities. We don't agree that freestanding cities in the middle of nowhere is a good way of dealing with these issues. And so we invented a place called Uster, and we created this diagram based upon a walkable city. So all the blue circles are 800 meters or 10-minute walk, and the red circle around the outside is 10 kilometers or a 20-minute tram ride. And we showed how you could double the size of an existing English city of about 200,000 people, taking a small proportion, about 7% of its green belt, in a way which is entirely servable by public transport, walking and cycling. And this was the drawing that came out of that, and we went through a process of how you would do that, how you would build that, and the conclusions that we came to, I'll end this talk with in a couple of minutes. This is the neighbourhood. So we work as sustainable urbanists. That's what we do, Urbed. The Urbed stands for Urbanism, Environment and Design. And we work for all sorts of clients, committed clients, less committed clients, and running up against the reality of what you have to do when you're building something for real is a very sobering experience. Because a lot of the wonderful ideas that we have, it's very difficult to implement on the ground. I've got a couple of examples of where we've made some progress. This is Trent Basin in Nottingham, done for a very good client of ours called Blueprint, which is half owned by the Igloo Investment Fund and half owned by Nottingham City Council. This is based upon, the housing is good performance in terms of energy. The key thing we've done here is a photovoltaic farm linked to a £1 million Tesla battery, which then takes the power from the solar farm and then sells it back to the grid. So as Paul was saying, this idea of locally based energy networks is something which you can do and actually does make financial sense. There's the plan of the scheme, and the other thing which I can make this work, which is great, which is the only project we've ever had where the brief was a poem. Whether you can read that going past, I won't go through it, but this idea that it was a new type of place, neither suburban nor urban, place which creates a new form of living. And that's what it looks like now. It's built. Mostly it's partly built, and a friend of mine lives there, and it's quite interesting getting feedback for what it's actually like to live there. This is another project. This is I'm not even sure I'm supposed to show this one yet, so I won't tell you where it is. It's an incredibly dense neighbourhood. It's 100 units per hectare gross. It's on the edge of a small city, and it's going to be almost entirely car-free. It has to be because we only have one road access with no capacity. So the car-free thing is a necessity rather than an ideological point, but it's a really interesting point for us in terms of being able to explore what that means. First thing we do, take away all the parking. Imagine how liberating that is as an urban designer to get rid of all the parking. All of a sudden, with so much you can do, the roads don't have to be designed to take cars on. All of a sudden, the road design becomes a whole different thing. Fantastically liberating thing to do. That's the plan, and that's the drawing of that as it stands at the moment. So, if we know what a sustainable city looks like, which I think we do, why are we still building here? Why are we still building this? Or this? Or this? That one actually takes examination. If you, as an urban designer, look at that drawing and say, what were they doing? But that's a whole different lecture, so I won't go there. As I said before, it's not because we don't know better, it's because doing the right thing is almost impossible. So what are we to do? I've got 7 propositions to finish that we need to deal with these things. The first is positive planning. And I should say the drawing in the background is a scheme of ours for York. But planning which puts the housing where it should be rather than in the least contentious site in the town. With a planning system which takes all the environmental constraints, takes all the consultation, and puts the housing where least people are going to object, which is almost always the least sustainable location it could be. So positive planning, plan properly, decide what the town is going to look like, and work towards positive planning. The second one is brownfield first. We've just been working on the Greater Manchester Spatial Framework. This is all the brownfield land in Greater Manchester. 83% of all the housing in Greater Manchester will go on brownfield land within the urban area. Brownfield first is also important. However, the next one's a contentious one, because after brownfield land, the next thing is the green belts. Not green fields, green belts. The green belt is the most sustainable place to build if you're not building within the city. Not the green site beyond the green belt, which is 15 miles away and can only be accessed by car. The green belt is where we need to expand if we need to expand cities. And we can have a debate about why we need to expand, maybe as part of the question time. Then infrastructure investment. We need to, Greater Manchester Transport, as part of the strategy, has got plans for billions of pounds worth of investment in terms of the tram system, the train system, the bus system, and so on and so forth. We need a way of funding proper infrastructure. That's the difference between us and Holland. They use the land value to invest in infrastructure. We have no way of funding the level of infrastructure that we need in our cities, which is always going to be a drawback. And to do that, we need to invest in land value capture. All the money in the UK from development goes to the landowner. We need to find a way it goes into the infrastructure that we build. That's a whole different lecture, but there's a fundamental point, a fundamental fault in our planning system which causes this to happen. Then two final ones. This is Brentford Lot West, a scheme of ours in London. And it used to be called development control in my days. I'm told it's now called development management. This idea that we have to spend 2 or 3 years to get a sustainable development through the planning system is just ridiculous. In other countries, planning is done much more effectively, much more fast track, and it doesn't make it worse. We have an incredibly slow planning system, and we still get crap at the end of it. We need to find a way of speeding up the system. And the final one, and this is not a scheme of ours, I should say, it's Edinburgh Newtown, but the final thing we need to reinvent is the idea of the master developer. The idea someone will take the land, put the infrastructure in, and then get small-scale builders to do the housing and the other development that go into it. Not a situation where we have top 10 volume house builders who do pretty much all the large sites in the country. We need to create another way of doing that. So those are my 7 suggestions. Let me put them as suggestions in terms of how we need to do this. Thank you very much.